James Pearce and the Falcons rookies continue to shine in the preseason, but key roster battles remain with cuts looming.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do, become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are doing a follow-up rookie report following the heels of this preseason week 2 action against the Tennessee Titans. We'll talk about the Falcons' 5 draft picks, or really the 4 that played in this Titans game. We'll talk about some of the ongoing roster battles where everything kind of stands at each position group now that we've gotten through 2 preseason games heading into this potential final stretch of training camp before final cuts are made. But let's start off talking about James Pearce Jr., right? Where I think he continued to show why, we are so excited to see what he can bring to the table as a pass rusher. I think he was arguably even better against Tennessee than he was in that first preseason action against the Lions, because you got to see a little bit more array of his pass rush moves. You got to see a little bit of power from James Pearce in addition to the speed that we've seen from him in this game. You had a really nice bull rush against Jalen Duncan in the second half of this game. And for those of you, and I know 99.9% of you guys are not very familiar with Jalen Duncan, the Titans' backup offensive tackle, he is a little susceptible. He's been always known to be a little light in the anchor when it comes to power. And so it's not a surprise that Pearce was able to put him on skates and get a pressure there. Now, when you look at Pearce's power against the other Titans offensive tackles in this game, it was a little less effective as it was against Jalen Duncan. Now, he did show a really good rep against Dan Moore at the beginning of the second quarter, where he showed really good pop in his hands, beating Moore across his face on an inside move. But, we put a little bit of an asterisk beside that one particular rep, because that came shortly, I think, on the series after Moore exited the game briefly. He had suffered a right leg injury where he got rolled up from behind. And you could see on the previous rep prior to Pearce beating Moore, he couldn't quite put as much weight on that right leg. And I think Pearce took advantage of that on the next play, which we like, by, beating him and being basically crashing through that door, because he couldn't necessarily stop that inside counter move from James Pearce. And so we put an asterisk on that because we wanted to see, how does James Pearce look against the starting caliber offensive tackles that he saw in this game? J.C. Latham, Dan Moore, for the 3 series that the starting offensive lineman got. And we saw some positives, particularly on that one rep against Moore. It was, nothing flashy in the other reps. Particularly against J.C. Latham and whatnot. And, that carries over from college when he and Latham matched up 2 years ago when Latham was at Alabama. He didn't do a whole lot in those games. But we're putting an asterisk beside it because, like, his 2 power wins came against a guy that's notorious for being light and a dumper, as my good buddy Jarvis Davis would say, and then taking advantage of an arguably injured player that proved to be light and a dumper on that. But we'll see how it translates to the regular season. You like seeing the flashes. That was a question about James Pearce. Like, we knew he had power, but is his power really going to be effective against starting caliber offensive tackles? We saw it against Dan Moore for 1 rep. We didn't quite see it for J.C. Latham. Obviously, we're going to see plenty more opportunities for him to showcase that power against regular season against starting caliber offensive tackles, and probably a couple of backups that will start games and whatnot. Hopefully we'll get a couple of Jalen Duncans on the radar this upcoming season. We got one potentially in week 1 with Tristan Wirfs being on the lineup. Shout out to Charlie Heck. But, that's going to be something interesting just because, as we've talked about a number of times on this podcast over the last several months and years, power translates. The one thing that NFL offensive tackles will tell you consistently is that they do not want guys to cave in their chest. And again, while James Pearce has that sort of power, does he have enough to really be effective consistently with that power at the next level? And in addition to the speed rush, because now if you have both the speed and the power, you're going to be really dangerous. But if you just have the speed, that's still fine, right? And especially as we've talked about since May, playing in this wide 9 scheme is going to do the most to accentuate that speed, but we want to see more of that power. So we'll see if we get to see more of that from James Pearce. Let's talk about the rest of the defensive rookies. We don't get to really talk about Jalen Walker because he's not playing on Friday night. Not really a whole lot to say about Jalen Walker until he can start showing that he can stay healthy. So we'll see how that goes over the next couple of weeks as we get ready for the regular season. When it comes to Billy Bowman and Xavier Watts, I thought both of those guys showed some things on Friday night. Nothing crazy or major that being like, oh man, these guys are incredible. I thought Watts was better in the sense of going back to the conversation we had with Jarvis Davis last week on one of the things he wanted to see from Xavier Watts being a little bit more aggressive, less hesitation when it came to coming downhill against the run. I think Watts did show that. Not a whole lot to glean from a coverage standpoint. I thought Bowman, outside of blowing up a couple of swing passes and screens, last week, or one against the Titans and one against the Lions, hasn't really done a lot, but for the most part has done his job. But as we said last week with Jarvis, that conversation on Thursday or Friday, we're kind of waiting for one of these guys to really pop in order to win the starting nickel competition that Bowman is in the midst of with D. Alford, and Xavier Watts is in the midst of that second safety starting competition with Jordan Fuller. And I don't think Bowman or Watts has done anything in these 2 preseason games to really pop to win those competitions. And at the same time, I don't think Alford and Fuller have done anything so far in these 2 preseason games to outright lose those competitions. So maybe we get another game to evaluate when it comes to the Dallas game at this point in time. But, particularly with a guy like Bowman, for me, we'll see what he shows in these preseason games, because him being able to hold down the forward in coverage against like wide receiver 4s, 5s, and 6s in these preseason games doesn't really move the needle that much for me, just because for me, as we've talked about this a number of times over the last 6 months, the big question for me at the nickel cornerback position, going back to the struggles of D. Alford, last year he struggled covering wide receiver 3s in addition to the wide receiver 1s and 2s. But in the previous years where we did get better play from D. Alford, he still struggled against the wide receiver 1s and 2s. And that to me is the question with Billy Bowman. If he's going to be the upgrade over D. Alford that we all hope and want him to be, can you cover the wide receiver 1s and 2s to a much higher degree? And that's what fuels some of my skepticism on whether Billy Bowman's going to be the long-term answer, because basically, as I see it, like if he was capable of covering number 1 wide receivers and 2s in the NFL, he probably wouldn't have spent 4 years playing safety at Oklahoma. He would have been a cornerback, an all-conference quarterback instead of an all-conference safety. So we'll see on that end. But I think all these rookies on the defense side of the ball are on track to contribute. I think a lot of the positivity surrounding Bowman is just because the bar is so low coming off the year from D. Alford that it's like, well, he could be, if he's 12% better, that's an upgrade. And so those are the things that are pointing up for this Falcons defense overall. But I think all these guys are positive contributors. We'll see how much a contributor is based off of how many snaps and are they starters and where this defense is going to be. Right now, my expectations for this defense is going to be, the 20th best, right? We're talking about reasonable expectations going back to James Pearce. He's on track for reasonable expectations in the sense of like 4 to 6 sacks, 30, 40 pressures. If you have higher expectations than that, and you're more than entitled to your opinion, if you have higher expectations in the Falcons being, the 20th best defense in the league, again, more entitled to your opinion on that one. But, I'm in wait and see mode. I got to see it first in September before. And of course, I'll be the first one if we do get to see it once we get to September and the real games happen. I'll be the first one sitting here going like, oh, this defense is finally living up to the hype. Hey guys, I think, this defense is starting to come together, which for the long time everydayers knows goes all the way back to that 2016 season where that was all we were talking about, even though that defense was like the 20th best defense or worse in the league that year. But hey, we'll take it here in Atlanta. We'll take that, especially when you can have an offense like we had in that 2016 season, which again, I think is going to be the key to this team's success this upcoming season. Whether they're going to be number one and historically good remains to be seen, but certainly I think there's a lot of upside. So that will be something that we'll continue talking about in the coming days as we get closer to the regular season and talking about Michael Penix and whatnot. But the rest of today's episode, we talked about the defensive rookies. We got one more rookie on offense, and that will get us into a conversation about the second string offensive line and which roster battles are still up for grabs as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. And these days, it feels like there's advice for everything, whether it's cold plunges and gratitude journals and screen detoxes. But how do you know what actually is going to work for you? With so much information online and mental health and wellness, it's easy to be overwhelmed, and you want to figure out what's true and what works best for you. And that's why talking to a licensed therapist through BetterHelp can make all the difference. You get real personalized guidance instead of just guessing based off something you saw on social media. I found that therapy isn't just about navigating major challenges or trauma. It's also about building positive coping skills that I put into every week when I watch the Atlanta Falcons. With over 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, serving over 5 million people. And it's easy to fit into your schedule. Just click to connect, and you can even switch therapists anytime if you need to. So talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So we got one more rookie to talk about. That's Jack Nelson, or one more draft pick to talk about. That's Jack Nelson, the 7th round offensive tackle. And, I don't spend too much time on Twitter during game days. Too busy chatting it up with the Locked On Falcons Insiders and in the Locked On Falcons Discord. Hit the links in the description below if you want to join that conversation. But, going back at the end of the night, scrolling through Twitter, he was getting killed on Twitter from a lot of folks. And that just comes with the territory when it comes to offensive line play. It's how we talk about it. Like, when guys, we focus on the hyperfixate on the extremes, the very good and the very bad. And it kind of ignores a lot of the stuff in the middle. And I think going back and watching the film and watching a lot of the stuff in the middle, I thought Jack Nelson was fine, right? Especially when you grade him on a rookie curve. And we're grading him on that rookie curve because if you go back and listen to when we talked about Jack Nelson in late June, we talked about him not necessarily being the most NFL ready guy and having low expectations and expecting him to have some struggles transitioning to the NFL this summer. But it was a question of, would we get some ups with the downs? And I feel like in both games, we've gotten those ups, particularly as a run blocker these past 2 weeks. So I feel like Jack Nelson was fine, relatively speaking. Again, if you thought he was coming into the league to be this NFL ready offensive tackle, I just think you had the wrong expectations, which is not surprising because, again, I think very few people actually sat down and watched him at Wisconsin. But we talked about it on the pod that, he's going to be a 3-year project. He's not necessarily NFL ready. And I think as far as like mid to late round offensive line projects that the Falcons have regularly drafted under Terry Fontenot, I like Jack Nelson a little bit better than I like Jalen Mayfield or Javon Gwynn or Justin Schaefer or any of those guys. And I feel like you've seen that in these 2 preseason games if you're focusing on the 90% that is the quote unquote mundane that no one focuses on, as opposed to the 10% that is the either extremely good or extremely bad with Jack Nelson. So that gets us to breaking down our roster in terms of talking about which roster spots are still up for grabs when we talk about this 53-man roster. We got 1 preseason game against Dallas on Friday. We got 9 days as I'm sitting here recording this on Sunday until roster cuts. I think this is technically day 26 of training camp. Out of 34 days of training camp, which means we're about 3/4 of the way through. And going back to an earlier conversation we had where it's like, we're now entering kind of the 4th quarter of training camp until roster cuts happen. So this is kind of the home stretch where some of these competitions will be won and lost and whatnot. And so talking about Jack Nelson in the offensive line, I had 10 guys making the roster on my pre-camp projection. I feel good about 7 of those, the 5 starters plus Storm Norton, assuming he's healthy, and Jack Nelson. I feel like those 3 interior spots are currently up for grabs. If the cuts were happening today, I do think Wilkinson, Gwynn, and Hinton would make it. At least 2 out of those 3 guys would make it. But I do think Jake Hansen, the newly signed center, as well as Joshua Gray, could make a push in this so-called fourth quarter. And then we'll also keep an eye on the waiver wire, right? This is not a new occurrence with the Atlanta Falcons, always needing to shore up the offensive line depth seemingly every summer, going all the way back to 2017 when they traded for Ty Sambraila. It just feels like every summer on this podcast we've been talking about, they got to get some help on the offensive line depth. And a lot of that is just due to their failure of being able to draft and or develop offensive linemen, because you look over the last 15 years, pretty much all their offensive linemen are either successful starters or out of the league in 3 years, right? And there's it's all black and white. There's no shades of gray. Now, we're hoping Jack Nelson is going to be the new trend, the start of a new trend, and be the exception to that rule. As I said in June, I wouldn't necessarily put a lot of money on betting against Jack Nelson, being sort of the guy that bridges those two things, which is not being a successful starter, but just being a quality backup. But we'll sort of have to see on that front. Now, looking at some of the other offensive positions, wide receiver and tight end, I feel like those spots are pretty settled. I think safety is another position that is settled. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I feel like, we know at least 6 of the wide receivers that are going to be kept on this roster. None of those guys played against the Titans, so that's telling. That's Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Raven McLeod, Kadero Hodge, Jamal Agnew, and Casey Washington. The question is, will we keep a 7th wide receiver? And if they do, I think that's likely to be David Sills, given that he got that quick hook on that opening drive. He didn't even finish the opening drive. They basically gave him 6 snaps and okay, you got 2 catches and we're good. He did get some late game work on special teams, including playing that personal protector on the punt team with DeMarco Hellens out of the lineup along. Xavier Watts also got some of that, punt protector work as well. And so I think right now, unless Mooney comes back before August 26th and is fully healthy, we're on track to see this team keep 7 wide receivers, at least through the initial cuts, just to have an extra body, ahead of Mooney's return, which will hopefully be week 1, but, we'll see on that front. If Mooney does come back between August 26th and September 7th, then, I think Sills will be the odd man out. But for the time being, he does look like he's on track to at least make it as the 7th guy. But we'll see if Chris Blair, I've been a fan of Chris Blair on this podcast. We'll see if he can make a push, as well as some of these other guys to unseat Sills. But it does feel like that's where the trajectory that we're on. So we'll see on that end. Tight end, I think we know who the 3 tight ends are going to be: Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner, Tegan Quitoriano. Quitoriano is a good blocker, unproven on special teams, and then to go out there in his real first action, I believe I saw, playing kickoff coverage to force a fumble and get a fumble recover, it pretty much locked that spot up. Now, looking at some of the other positions on offense, quarterback, we know who the 3 guys are going to be. It's just a question of will they keep the 3rd guy on the roster or the practice squad, right? Easton Stick, I know people are down on Easton Stick after his performance on Friday night, understandably. It's just a question of, will he be on the 53-man roster? Will he be on the practice squad? After the Lions game, I was like, he's probably going to be on the roster. After the Titans game, he's probably going to be on the practice squad. So Dallas is going to be the tiebreaker next week. So we'll see. Emory Jones, I feel like, is a project at this point in time that I'm not particularly interested in trying to develop. But obviously he's going to be dealing with potentially a concussion that may limit his ability to play on Friday against the Cowboys. So that will be something that we'll keep an eye on if the Falcons decide to bring in a quarterback or whatnot, just to have another body. Where's John Paddock when you need him? But, running back, we know who 2 of those guys are going to be, Bajan and Tyler Algier. It's just a question of who the RB3 is going to be. I think we will see the team keep 3 running backs on the roster. We haven't seen Carlos Washington so far in the preseason because he's been nursing a hamstring injury. Nathan Carter showed you on Friday he's got some juice that makes him a strong consideration there. Jayshon Corbin continues to get reliable work on special teams. I think ultimately who's that RB3 is going to boil down to who can add value on special teams and who's going to add value on as a pass protector on 3rd downs, right? And so far, Corbin has gotten, of the 3 running backs that have played in the preseason, between Corbin, Elijah Dotson, and Nathan Carter, Corbin's got the bulk of those pass protecting snaps with 7. Dotson's had 3, and Carter has had 0 at this point in time. Now, Corbin had a great block in the Lions game in that 2-minute drill where Easton Stick was really shining, but he had a bad block early in this Titans game where he contributed to giving up a sack in addition to Kyle Hinton on that play. And so kind of similar conversation. The Dallas game could be the tiebreaker if he goes out there, but it'll be notable if we get to see Nathan Carter get some of these pass blocking reps, because that's going to matter. As you've heard me say many times over the years, like running back ability is kind of a dime a dozen. The thing that's going to determine your success and your ability to stick in this league long-term is, can you block for the team's most valuable asset, which is that quarterback? And if the answer is no, unless you're Derrick Henry or Adrian Peterson, you're not going to see the field, or Nick Chubb or LeGarrette Blount. And that's really about it. Leonard Fournette. Okay. Those 5 guys are the exception to the rule. But everybody else, you got to block, or else you're not going to be in the league, which is why like Quadri Olison, for those of you that recall him, never really stuck in Atlanta long-term and whatnot. But let's, talk a little bit more about these ongoing roster battles by switching sides to the defense side of the ball. And our big question there is just going to be, how many defensive linemen are the Falcons going to wind up keeping? And that could have ramifications for some of these other defensive spots as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. The NFL season is almost here, which means fantasy football is back in full swing, and Yahoo Fantasy is turning things up with a fantasy football experience like never before this year. I'm playing Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making their millionth league. I've been a Yahoo Fantasy user for almost 20 years, and the updates they're rolling out this month are, pun intended, fantastic. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. To kick it all off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo with the lowest scoring team getting eliminated each week until there's one team left standing. With the season around the corner, now is the time to get your league together and give this new mode a try. And if you're more into the classics, you can still play a head-to-head private league or join a public one. Stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. So the question along the defensive line is, how many do they keep? 10, 11, 12, 13, counting D-linemen and edge rushers. We kind of know the hierarchy, although we can debate, who's 9, who's 10, who's, and whatnot and beyond. But we know there's 5 locks to make the roster at edge: Arnold Bichetti, Jalen Walker, James Pearce, Leonard Floyd, and Braylon Trice. There's 4 locks on the defensive line. On the interior defensive line, David Onyemata, Ruka Roro, Brandon Dorlus, Zach Harrison. We are no longer concerned at this point in time that the Falcons might make David Onyemata a surprise cut, but now our concerns, Morgan Fox becomes the potential surprise cut for the Falcons. I'm confident that we'll see them keep at least 10 D linemen, with that 10th guy being the interior D lineman, which presumably would be Morgan Fox, but it's possible, whether it's Taquan Graham, which seems unlikely with Graham nursing a calf injury, but maybe Kentavious Street or LaCale London could, leapfrog Fox. I think the fact that Street is quote unquote starting games, getting reps at nose tackle when the Falcons are playing their 3-4 base defense in these preseason games are meaningful. So to me, it's probably between Fox and Street for that 10th spot. I'm confident we'll see 10, that 10 will be at least active on game day, and we'll probably carry an 11th guy. So I could see Fox and Street both making it. And that 11th guy will probably be inactive on game day. I've seen several projections of people saying that the Falcons might keep 12 or 13 D linemen. And that's certainly a possibility, although I personally feel like you'll start to get diminishing returns if you keep more than 11. If you imagine in an NFL game, you'll see about 64 defensive snaps. If you play a 4-man front for, your nickel front for about 75% of those snaps, and a 5-man front in your base for 25%, that would be about 272 snaps between the D-line and edge rushers combined up front. And we know that we're going to see a regular rotation, as Nate Ollie, the Falcons D-line coach, and several players have said, you're going to play 4 snaps and then you're going to be out. And so that means that we'll see a regular rotation. So on average, those 10 guys that are presumably going to be active would play about 27 snaps per game. If we have 11 guys active, that's 25. If we have 12 guys active, that's 23. If we have 13 guys, that's 21. So that's where where you get diminishing returns, where it's just like you're not really saving reps, right? You're giving a guy maybe one more one less snap per game. And like, again, that could be meaningful, but probably not that meaningful. And then for reference, Lorenzo Carter averaged about 31 snaps per game last year. Eddie Goldman averaged about 19 snaps per game. So that would be about the average usage for anybody on this D-line. And so basically, I think the more bodies you keep up front, the more bodies you're taking away elsewhere, particularly guys that can actually contribute on game day on special teams at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, linebacker, corner, and safety positions. So I'm leaning towards them keeping just 11 guys. It's just, to me, a question of who those last two spots are going to be, that 10th and 11th guy. Again, I think Fox, Street, London, Graham, Khalid Kareem are all in the mix. I would bet on Fox and Street at this point in time, and the others being likely practice squad guys, but we'll see. Linebacker, we kind of know four of them: Caden Ellis, Divine Diablo, JD Bertrand, and D'Angelo Malone. I don't think Malone is a lock, but I think he's a safe bet due to his special teams ability. To me, the question is, do you keep a fifth guy? I think so. Again, you can have that guy contribute on special teams as opposed to a D lineman that's not going to contribute on special teams and get, I don't know, 8 snaps a game or whatever he would be getting as a 12th or whatever D lineman. But I think that fifth spot right now is boiling down to between Josh Woods and Caleb Johnson. Caleb Johnson's been a regular on special teams in the preseason. Woods has not. So I do feel like, that special teams ability, Johnson certainly has had a better body of work on special teams throughout his NFL career than Josh Woods has, although Woods had a really good game against the Lions on defense. So that will be a question. Obviously, the other question at linebacker is what's going to happen with Troy Anderson. Right now, it seems like he's poised to start the season on the PUP list, so he won't count towards the 53-man roster, but maybe we get some good news in the next 9 days. At cornerback, I think we know the top 5. AJ Terrell, Mike Hughes, Billy Bowman, Natron Brooks, and Mike Ford. Again, Ford I don't think is a lock, but another safe bet due to his special teams ability. Will they keep a 6th corner? To me, this could come down to, hey, we keep a 6th corner or a 12th D lineman. I would sit here and say Clark Phillips is the default guy, but we'll see. He's currently injured with a rib injury. Kobe Bryant's down with a hamstring injury. This is what's going to give CJ Henderson a shot for that 6th spot. Lamar Jackson has been kind of meh. I don't think Dante Manning's going to make it as on the roster, but maybe on the practice squad. So right now, I think Clark Phillips will make it and be that 6th corner as we sit here, but we'll just sort of have to see and keep an eye on his injury status. As I said earlier, safety, I think, is a settled position. We know who the 4 guys are going to be. We know who's going to be number 1 in that hierarchy in Jesse Bates. We know who's going to be number 4 in that hierarchy in DeMarco Ellams. It's just a question of who's 2, who's 3 between Xavier Watts and Jordan Fuller. So that will still have to be determined, but we know who those 4 safeties are going to be. And then, of course, as we said on Friday, special teams, who seemingly has locked down the kicker spot unless he starts shanking kicks this week in practice. And then we'll have to revisit this conversation, but we'll see Koo on the roster. We'll see the German sensation, Lenny Krieg, on the practice squad, and we'll see what Lenny Krieg probably, I'm assuming, will get all the action kicking against the Cowboys. So we'll see on that front. That's kind of where I think the roster stands. That's where I think the rookies are at this point in time. So arrows pointing up for the rookies. We still got some back-end roster battles to figure out across the roster, as well as, at least 2 starting spots in the secondary. So that will be continued conversations here on Locked On Falcons. If you want to get a look at some of these things I'm talking about, particularly with the rookies, as well as some of the other highlights or lowlights from Friday's action and looking at the film, I'll be doing a all 22 breakdown for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. You can become a Locked On Falcons Insider by joining that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You can get that breakdown for free, probably when it drops on Monday. It's a 14-day free trial and then $4.99 a month if you want to continue to be an insider during the regular season and get those extended all 22 breakdowns come September. So that's all there for you. This week will, as I mentioned at the top, we'll be probably getting some outside thoughts on Michael Penix and sort of what he's expected to be. I don't know. I sat down and had a conversation with Matt Waldman about Michael Penix, and you guys may recall Matt Waldman was very high on Michael Penix after the Falcons drafted him. And so we'll revisit Matt's thoughts on that, as well as maybe another upcoming guest later this week. And I don't know if that's all going to just be one episode, because I'm assuming that we'll have some things to talk about in Falcons practice on the daily. So we might spread that conversation with Matt Waldman and that upcoming guest over the course of multiple days this week, but we'll just play that by ear. But that is in store for you as you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And do so, by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. It's going to give you that prep every single day for your upcoming fantasy drafts, as well as make you the most informed manager so that you can take your league's trophy this season. Find Locked On Fantasy on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.